no longer obligated to be. That's just fine. Yeah.
I don't know. So this is because you identify something like this. Oh, no, it shouldn't be one more. It really shouldn't be one more. I think the one I used in class is
Hi. So we have a guest speaker, somebody not only not in the department, but not even in computer science traditionally. Robb Diehl is a migratory biologist at the U.S. Geological Survey. Did his PhD at University of Illinois. And was a professor for a while there.
In Mississippi.
In Mississippi, before coming to USGS. And he's going to be talking to us about remote sensing. And since the theme of the semester has been big data, data science types of issues, hopefully you're going to see another side, especially from an application perspective, of some of these problems. So, Rob,
thanks, John. Thank you. As John said, I am going to approach this with you from an applied computing standpoint, and most of what I tell you is not going to have a whole lot to do with computer science. But part of my goal is to maybe canvas for interest, because as an ecologist, as a biologist, we are constantly on the lookout for folks to help us solve our increasing number of computational problems. So I'm going to throw a few of them out today, and just to give you a flavor for the kinds of things that we deal with as ecologists. One thing that you'll gather right away is that, for any of you who have dealt with real-world data, most of the issues that we have concern signal and noise ratios. And so I thought that a fitting alternate title to this might well be how low signal noise ratios will keep us employed. And that is true for a lot of you. You're going to be dealing with noise if you're analyzing real data. So we're going to explore noise a little bit in the context of some of the things that I do in relation to remote sensing, especially from the standpoint of monitoring the movements of flying animals, which is mostly where I spend my time. Okay. Increasingly, we're realizing that most of ecology operates outside our senses. Okay, and so here's a list of some of the ways in which that happens. Our senses are bounded. Okay, we can only see when it's bright enough. We can only hear certain things, and so on and so forth. But nature is invisible, subtle, magnetic, bright, hot, cold, and whatever. And this is what's pushed us toward using different forms, I think, of remote sensing. So increasingly, this field, which you might think of as dominated by people tromping around in the woods with binoculars in their hands, is dominated by people that are programmers at some level, extremely statistically savvy, and spend much more time at their desks than they do tromping around in the woods. Okay, and so this top statement is true. And when I started graduate work in, I guess it was '92, I had taken some computer science courses at Purdue, which is where I did my undergrad. And I knew I wanted to marry these two fields together. And I was looking for a PhD advisor that would satisfy my interest in ecology and software. And there were very few people around that actually married those things together. Today, it's a very, very different world in that regard. So I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the difference between human and autonomous data collection. Since the world is moving, to the right over there, I thought we should spend a few minutes looking at the pros and cons of each. So humans are great in the field, okay? You don't get very low signal to noise ratios when someone is out there thinking about what they're doing. That is not the case when you take instrumentation that's often a dumb sensor, plop it out there and have it do something. Sometimes the sensors are good, sometimes not. Our raw data sets that are generated by humans are relatively noise free. That can be quite opposite the case with an automation. Humans, however, are somewhat error prone. So it's important to recognize that error and noise are different things. Okay? A human can write something down wrong. They can forget to document something. They can fail to notice something. Okay? And at some level, that's an error. Usually, if properly calibrated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, field-deployed instrumentation measures what you tell it to. Okay? A thermometer is going to do a pretty good job. And they're going to generate lots of results and lots of data. And this is one of the reasons why you see increasingly ecologists and scientists of all stripes moving toward field-deployed or other kinds of automation and instrumentation. People are expensive, technology less so. But one real risk is that you may encounter circumstances when, you could get hurt, or you could even get killed, all right? That fellow that was in the previous image, the older field technician, he died doing what he was doing. He was doing radio telemetry, and do people know what radio telemetry is for wildlife? Have any idea? We have a couple folks. You put a little radio tag on an animal and you wave your wand around and you find out where it is. It's a really bad way to spend a lot of time. But this is what this guy did. He made his living doing that, and he really loved it. And he was so exhausted after working for 24 straight hours that he fell asleep on the train tracks and was hit by a train. So improving human safety is a genuine issue in relation to automation. Okay. So the side effect of all this here is that this noise mitigation problem is becoming a back-end problem for ecologists, whereas before it wasn't. Okay, before it was a human problem and you solve it in real time. Now it's a programming problem, right? Swapped. So this is electromagnetic spectrum, as you might see on Wikipedia. As wildlife ecologists, we're using a lot of it today. Some of it involves humans doing things. But most of this is our deploying instrumentation to use different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum to make measurements on free-ranging animals. Okay? And that's the context where I'd like to talk about today. If people see things that they're interested in, I am not the only ecologist in town. There are scads of people like me around here. And they often have very similar problems, okay? The technologies may be different, but most of us at some level need help. And overcoming these computational challenges are required for empowering certain kinds of remote sensing technologies, okay? Now, it's easy to imagine that, someone that's involved in physics or certain aspects of chemistry or other fields that are considered harder, which is to say not soft, people are familiar with that distinction, had need for these kinds of services, which is to say computational, for a long time. But it's becoming much more widespread in my field. So the three examples I'm going to present today are as follows. One, the biological application of weather radar. Now that may seem weather radar biology, but it turns out that weather radars do a really good job seeing things flying around the airspace, and we're going to see examples of that. Some of the challenges that we encounter are noise mitigation, classification, and there is a need for some near real-time processing that does happen now in relation to meteorology, but not biology. Acoustic monitoring, we'll talk about this a little bit, especially in relation to bird songs and calls. And target classification or song classification is the primary goal there. And then finally, thermal imaging of free-flying animals. Those data can be noisy, but really this is a different problem than these other two examples, in that the cameras detect things aloft, and we need to be able to track them in the camera's view space. Okay. So I want to get back to this human data collection issue just to make the point, you know, or reify this point a little bit about where we were and where we have gone as come as ecologists. In 1952, this guy George Lowry harnessed the human population, thousands of hours of observation from volunteers, over 1,000 volunteers scattered all across the continent, North America, okay? And what they did is get out at night and point their telescopes at the moon and watch birds that migrate mostly at night passing the face of the moon. And they sent their results, their observations, to George Lowry, who compiled all this stuff. And it took him, 10 years to analyze the data. It actually took him 14 years to publish the paper, okay? Because he had to do all the trigonometry and all this stuff himself by hand, all right? And this was the first, however, this is the first time we had a view of the scale at which bird migration was occurring. It's an international phenomenon. It is a continent scale phenomenon, okay? Today, 50 years later, his PhD student, Sid Gautreaux, who uses radar, just recently retired, but used radar to study animal movements, did the same thing after 2 hours of processing, okay? So that's 50 years, and we've gone from 10 years to analyze the data to 2 hours of processing. Now there's a catch in that George Lowry had people out there that knew what they were looking at, okay? Sid Gautreaux had instruments out there that recorded whatever the hell they wanted to, okay? So he had to do a lot of pre-screening by hand, if you will, okay? He's looking at images of radar data and saying, okay, that's birds, that's precipitation, okay, that's ground clutter, and so on and so forth. And so there are a lot of days spent trying to do this. And by the way, these are snapshots. This is just a few days. Bird migration happens for most of the year, okay? Sometimes more than others, but most of the year things are moving. So this is better. This is an improvement over this, but nonetheless, we have very intelligent people spending a lot of time doing rote things. And this is when automation comes screaming. So this is the radar system. There are two different kinds of radars. They're essentially the same, but one is called the WSR-88D. It's also called NexRad. Has anyone ever heard of NexRad? You turn on the Weather Channel and they show precipitation marching across the screen. That's this guy, okay. Terminal Doppler weather radar is a similar design that's intended to monitor the weather in relation to airports, but they both function pretty similarly, and so operationally, I consider them part of the same system. But we're going to talk mostly about NexRad today. Okay. In the NexRad system, there are about 160 radars, and they are identical, and that's really nice. Okay. That means you're not dealing with 100 different flavors of something sitting out there. And anyone who's done any programming for hardware would be grateful for this. Okay. Each radar generates 6 parameters. Okay, so 6 different views of the world, and most importantly, it's digital. The system before this, which was called the WSR-57, as in 1957, as in not digital, barely transistor. That means this is actually the most important metric here. Okay, things that aren't digital, that weren't digital, now are, and that really empowers us to do some interesting things. The data archive is deep and big. How much is 2 petabytes? Seriously? What is 1 petabyte? Has anyone ever dealt with petabytes of data before? Terabytes, right? We all do terabytes, right? So 1,000 terabytes in a petabyte, so 2,000 terabytes, okay, uncompressed. And so we're really concentrating on the blue line here because level 2 is what we use. And the data rate has gone up following an exponential trend as the radar system has been modified over the years to do more and more and more. So there's enormous amounts of data pouring into this thing, okay? A large portion, as you will see, is biological, which is counterintuitive since they've misnamed it a weather radar. But the consequence of that is that this is one of the largest biological data sets in the world, hands down, okay? But it's scarcely being used as a biological resource. And the primary reason why is that you have to have a special set of expertise to be able to get at the data. There's very little automation, although it's growing, and people don't understand what they're looking at when they see the data, okay? So it's time consuming and intellectually demanding in many respects in ways that are not common for an ecologist. We're trying to bridge that gap, okay? So the 6 radar parameters, one is common, and this is the one that people see. Of the 6, you turn on the Weather Channel and see something marching across, this is the one that you see. You never see the other 5. They almost never show them, okay? They won't. So this is just how much stuff is up there. Strong rain, brighter colors, weak rain, weaker colors. And there are 3 different things going on here, actually. This precipitation. This is a purple martin roost. Purple martins get up in the airspace and they radiate out in 2 dimensions, in a ring. Okay, they roost together and then millions of birds sort of depart and radiate out. These are probably insects up here. Okay. Now this is what the same thing looks like in the other 5 parameters. Okay. For people that have done classification kinds of problems before, your eye, which is a good pattern recognizer, should automatically start sort of parsing through these and sort of see where these different data types start to separate themselves. One thing we also know, given that we can see the world in 6 different ways, is that we have a parameter space that has some heft to it when it comes to data classification problems, okay, from an algorithmic point of view. Here's a distribution of radars. I won't spend a lot of time on that. These systems are not unique to the United States. Other countries have them as well. Europe's system is larger than ours, and this isn't even comprehensive. You know, South Korea's got radars. Japan's got radars. Everyone's got radars these days. And so the systems vary in subtle ways, but the problems that a biologist in Canada or Europe or wherever might encounter are the same kinds and flavor of problem that I'm talking about with you here today. So the problem is portable, so the solutions may well be as well. How does a radar see flying animals? This is sort of an animation. You'll see things moving. It's a simulation I put together based on real data, actually. But what happens is that these radars are sweeping around. They're just rotating like this all the time. And animals are rising up out of the landscape. These are mostly birds. And these distributions are pretty real, actually. Each dot's a bird. And then they rise up out of the landscape when the sun sets and the radar sweeps by and sees them. Okay, so, but this obviously, this is the onset of a large nocturnal migration of songbirds. But this basic idea, birds, bats, insects, whatever, they do spend time on the ground, and so radar naturally does not see them until they get up in the airspace. But radar has a limited view to see them as well. They do have to occupy certain parts of the airspace to do so. This is what NextRad sees when you have a songbird migration in progress in the middle of the night at the continental scale. For comparison, this is Hurricane Rita. Now, I don't know if you guys are old enough to remember things like Hurricane Rita, but this is a bad hurricane, and it swept ashore here, it caused all this damage. I was actually living in Mississippi at the time. It was very exciting. I was in Hurricane Katrina too. That was much more exciting because that went this way. This here is all songbird migration with smatterings of insects and bats thrown in, okay? So in this moment, the radar is detecting far more biological than meteorological echoes. Right now, it's biological radar, okay? And what happens when the sun sets in the east and the terminator rolls across the United States is that you see the onset of migration. This snapshot's taken 4 hours into the night. Here's what the previous 4 hours looks like. So this is birds getting up into the atmosphere. The sun is setting in the west, birds migrate at night, terminator rolls across the United States, everything starts moving. And of course, Hurricane Rita comes ashore, okay? So you can see now, when people make the claim that this may be as much a biological radar as it is a meteorological one, there's a lot of data pouring in that's biological, okay? And this pattern, this happens all the time, okay? During spring and fall primarily, but these things happen, this happens all the time. you don't see it, because if you have the Weather Channel, they try to filter that stuff out. And mostly they're successful. But sometimes they're not if you know what to look for. Okay. So this is data classification problem. The radar sees many kinds of targets. Rain, trees, the ground, trains on overpasses, trucks on overpasses, highways, dust, atmospheric irregularities, and flying animals of all stripes. Okay. So the current algorithms that NOAA, National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, uses to try to sift through this stuff is focused on retaining and identifying information about precipitation. Okay? In other words, the focus isn't on biology. Biology is noise to those guys. Okay? So if we're interested in biology, we simply can't take their algorithms and invert them, because their algorithms are being trained to recognize and cope with issues associated with precipitation. Okay? Although they played around with biology. So this is a critical need for us. Okay? Currently, as I explained already, if we use these kinds of data to do biology, we're doing a lot of visual screening of the data. Okay? And that human aspect of it really limits what you can do. So there are 160 radars. If I was going to do a continental scale study like Sid Gotro did in the early 2000s, am I supposed to sit and look at data that gets updated every 5 minutes to 10 minutes for 160 different radars for 2 nights for 10 years? You can't do that, right? So you can see now that there's a real limitation. Okay. Does it matter? Yeah, it matters. All these things is well beyond what I do. I do this, okay, and a little bit of this, and a little bit of this. But all these things here have an influence, or are influenced by our ability to track the movement of animals, okay? Flight safety. Sullenberger lands in the river, right? What did he hit? He hit geese. These radars are very good at seeing geese, right? So you may be able to build, using these kinds of data, maps where hazards are increased owing to low-flying large birds, all right? So the data that we're talking about today has a potential to impact on all these areas in the ways that are described there, and in more ways that are described there. I just don't have the space to go into it all. Okay. Now, people have tried to take swipes at this problem from a biological standpoint. We have here, we've had a couple master's students work on the problem. It's a big problem, bigger than a master's project probably, and it's a challenging problem. And so I wouldn't say that we've solved this yet. In fact, nobody has solved this problem from the biological standpoint yet. I had a meeting this year, a couple months ago, in Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma, which is the center of the world for radar, weather radar research. And a bunch of us sat and were talking about the primary problem facing the empowerment of these data for biological research, and it's the problem I'm presenting to you today, the ability to data mine the existing archive for biological information. Okay, so our tentative approach to this problem has been sort of twofold. We first, at least minimally, try to distinguish biological from non-biological stuff. At least pull out the biology, okay? That would be a big step. If we could achieve that, that would save a lot of human time. Ideally, we'd go one step further and say, okay, we pulled out the biology, and these are the insects, or these are the bats, okay? So one can think about it as a two-step problem. Whether one should is another question. But I'm going to present it this way. In terms of biological versus non-biological, today, unlike 5 years ago, this is more than a mere curiosity for meteorologists. They're starting to pay attention to this because there's so much stuff up there. And it's interesting to some of these guys. Meteorologists didn't used to care about this stuff. 15 years ago, they didn't believe that some of the pictures that I showed you were biological. I have sat in the Weather Service offices and had them insist to me that what we were looking at was anomalous propagation, which is the trash bag of answers when you have no idea what's actually up there. And they're wrong. There's a lot of biology going on. But their efforts have been feeble. They don't know what they're doing. They're not biologists. It does matter, believe it or not. And so they've been able to generate very little training data for their algorithms. So their efforts are sort of half-baked at best. Nonetheless, they produce products like this. This is a classification product, and there obviously are some artifacts in here owing to range. We can talk about that if people have questions, but there is one called bi, and it's all these gray echoes in here have been classified as biological. Okay, so they're trying to do this. They're just doing it badly. We tried it here. These are some of the methods that Reggie Mead used as master's students here a few years ago. We had decent classification, but we didn't have a lot of training data. That's my fault. And it turned out that the results were largely influenced by one measure, this reflectivity product. Okay, this is the classification output. It's not wrong, really, kind of mostly, but we know that this one measure should not be driving the classification because it overlaps with a lot of other things. Reflectivity does not separate well biological from the precipitation from other kinds of things, and so we know that that's an issue. But anyway, there are a lot of things out there. This is kind of like the picture we just looked at, right? Okay, a lot of biology happening here. These are hawks, sort of streams of migrating hawks moving along the Texas coast. Do this every year, okay? Big rivers of hawks, okay? The background may be insects, I'm not sure. These are insects, these are mayflies. They mate and they erupt into the airspace. They cause all kinds of traffic problems and make big messes and whatnot, wherever that's happening. This is Wisconsin area. These are bats. Anybody who's ever visited Central Texas should know about bats, because there are enormous numbers of Mexican free-tailed bats in Texas, and they have these sort of ring-shaped patterns when they depart, much like the purple martins that we were looking at, a few minutes ago. Ducks, geese, cranes are all departing from water bodies in southeastern Wisconsin. Okay, so there's a lot of different things, and the patterns are all vaguely different. Okay, but this is just reflectivity. We're just looking at it in one metric, and there's a lot of overlap there. Okay, so that's not going to be a very good discriminator. Now, I played around with this a little bit, just using principal components analysis in using two types of known echoes. One, purple martins, and another eared grebes. Okay, and so, yeah, you can kind of do it. These aren't robust methods for discrimination. It's not really, PCA is not intended for that purpose. It's just what I could pull out. I had code already, written to produce this, but it's promising. Okay, no one's really tried to do this yet. Take the different species and see if they separate out along these parameters. Okay, from a classification problem. So that's the radar, the weather radar problem that we're dealing with right now. I want to talk about a couple other things. Sampling by sound. Okay. Believe it or not, this is a critical method for understanding the behavior and ecology of birds. Okay, thousands of birds, their management and conservation is impacted by our ability to find them and detect them and look at their distributions and so on and so forth. And so we get people out there that are walking around, graduate students, other kinds of folks walking around, listening, sampling by ear. And it's fun to be in the woods, right? But once again, it's also not very efficient, okay? And this is the principle. I like doing this. It's just not a very efficient use of my time. And so I'm just going to throw up an example here. This is a sound. This is a sonogram. I don't know if people have ever looked at sound this way before. This is time. This is frequency. And amplitudes come out toward you. Okay, darker is stronger. And there's a few things going on here that are worth noting. We have an unknown bird here, making tweets. A passing car generates some broadband noise at lower frequencies, okay, or what we would call noise. The focus for this study was the common yellow-throated, and that's what this column is here. And if we take this and sort of expand it, you can see there's a lot of structural features in this thing, okay? These are digital data, just like everything today is digital. And so, especially in acoustic data, noise, environmental noise is a huge problem. This, as I say, is a very low noise sample. It's a joke. Wind noise is very broadband, and when you impose wind noise over animal sounds, it's just a mess. Okay, this is pretty nice. Is that me? No. Okay. So, increasingly, we're deploying automatic units, automatic recording units, autonomous recording units to do it. They generate large data sets. There is some post-processing software out there to do noise mitigation, primarily. But mostly biologists are listening to recorded data and screening it by their ears anyway, okay? And instead of just taking a walk in the woods, you have to sit in your office and listen to recordings all day, and you might not be listening to recordings from one microphone that's been working for 24 straight hours. It might be 50 microphones, okay? So, because this is a technology that scales, but the human component doesn't, all right? So the goal here is to automate the acoustic species identification, as I say, by supervised classification. Now, I'm going to just present the case of the Ivory-billed woodpecker. Has anyone ever heard of an Ivory-billed woodpecker? One person has heard of an Ivory, two, a handful of people. This is in the news a lot lately, okay? Cornell got in big trouble over this kind of. It was thought to be extinct, okay? And so some guys thought they saw it, okay? And so this caused the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is one of the premier research, ornithological bird research labs in the country, to go and do all kinds of censusing, searching, surveying, whatever. And one of the things they did was deploy automatic recording units as sort of as pictured here, the microphones inside this windscreen. And so it's a 12-bit omnidirectional mic, a little bit of signal processing on board, big hard disk, the usual things that you might expect to find in this. In terms of post-processing, there's a little bit of software screening, but once again, humans get involved. Okay, even though they were looking for one bird, okay? One of the problems, however, was that the only acoustic sounds they had from this thing were from 1935. So they had very little training data to go on, okay? So this probably necessitated this, in addition to the fact that this was a really high stakes issue, okay? When Cornell decided that they had found this thing, they published a paper in Science. The lead author was the head of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I know him, he's a nice guy, but what ended up happening years later, or as time continued, is they weren't able to get a picture of this thing. No video, no picture. In other words, they really lacked that hard, fast data, okay? Even the acoustic data they gathered, they couldn't be sure that what they were hearing was an ivory-billed woodpecker. So at the end of the day, today, as of today, it's considered to be extinct. But this really raised a stink for 5 years, starting in 2004. They bought land, Nature Conservancy bought land, Cornell bought land. People were roaming around the landscape for 5 years looking for this thing, and they never found it, okay? Not really. So, egg on the face of Cornell. But they did deploy some arrays. Increasingly, people are empowered by, are collecting acoustic data on their own. Because one of the things that you have out there is this huge base of bird enthusiasts. I mentioned, it was on a previous slide, but I didn't talk about it. There are on the order of 50 million people that feed birds or watch birds. And so for a scientific field to have access to a citizen science resource like that is unique, novel, all right? So we have all these people out there, and they're so enthusiastic. Birders are weird, by the way. They're so enthusiastic about what they're doing that they'll take microphones out. I can't explain the culture. It's a breed apart, but they're also usually very intelligent and pretty well-off people. So there are some positive side effects to this. So, in addition to the proliferation of smartphones, you have technology being built into the smartphone itself, including microphones. Right? This is a small shotgun microphone. Okay, small shotgun condenser mic. There are all kinds of things out there like this, and people are starting to carry them around. And there's even a website called Cantu, which is a strange name that I won't explain, but the site is dedicated to the accumulation of independently recorded acoustic bird data. Okay. Now, we've talked about two sort of classification problems that would require training data, presumably. Radar, and now we're talking about acoustics. Radar is challenged in this regard because there are many people that can do this. There's just a handful of people that can go, you can train people to do it, it's easy to train people to do it, but at the end of the day there just aren't many people inherently trained to do this sort of thing, whereas the acoustics situation is a little different. we know that the crowd can collect data, which is to say these enthusiasts. It's already happening. The question I have is, can we crowdsource the training? All right, and what does that mean? If we're crowdsourcing the training, what are we asking people to do? We're asking people to listen to what's being recorded and score it, verify it. It is this, okay, at this location. This has never really been tried before, okay? Not really. To show the pipeline here, we're going to start with a smartphone and mic app or remote microphone array, like what Cornell was using with the Ivory-billed Woodpecker. You gather the data, you have a repository, you do a little bit of noise filtering, because if you have long gaps of nothing happening, you don't want that. That doesn't matter, and software for that exists and is relatively easy to deploy. You make the stuff available, and you announce to the population of enthusiasts that you want them to help with this, okay? Now, Cornell, these guys are masters at citizen science. They have programs, they have programs called Feeder Watch and eBird, and they have tens of thousands of people that are voluntarily uploading data to Cornell, okay? So the citizen science base is already there, okay? And so the idea would be to compel them, if they are interested, to download a snip of data, listen to it, identify it if they can, which I'm calling it scoring. And then we give them a little bit of feedback, because these people are very competitive. You know, I've uploaded this much data to Cornell's website. I've identified this many species, and so on and so on. You can imagine all kinds of creative ways in which you can feed back people's efforts to themselves so that they compete with one another. And then you don't consider someone's opinion about whether a certain sound is this bird or that bird. You throw it back into the data. So this is sampling with replacement, and you let someone else score it. 18 people agreed with you, but 3 people didn't. 27 people agreed with you, but 522 didn't. Those are the sorts of things that birders pay attention to, okay? And that's the sort of thing that you can begin to empower here. Well, if that works, again, you're reinforcing the behavior by giving them data on their effort. Then you might be able to then take the output from this and do science, right? It could be training data for an algorithm, or outreach and education, whatever the case may be. Obviously, we're talking about the computer science aspect of this, and so I've talked about that. So I'll say a little bit more about the training data aspect. In principle, this pipeline, if you will, never closes. In the same vein that the radar system is always gathering new data, right? People are going to be wandering around. Either the scientists are going to be deploying acoustic arrays for some reason or another. In fact, there's a project in Yellowstone where I think it's Harvard biologists are deploying arrays of acoustic recording equipment to locate wolves by arrival delays to the acoustic array. But those arrays are hearing everything, okay? Those microphones are detecting all kinds of animal sounds. They're focused on the wolves. Other people might be focused on other things. Okay. So the data presumably is continuing to come in, all right, which means that you're constantly updating your training data set and your test set. Okay. So this process of retraining the classifier and evaluating it technically never has to stop as long as this keeps happening. Okay. So in this way, you may be able to empower people to be your supervised, to score training data in a supervised learning classification algorithm. As far as I know, I don't know if anyone's ever done this sort of thing before, but the infrastructure seems to be in place to allow for it. Okay. Now, these are the processing on this is literally, as they say, embarrassingly parallel. These problems are easily decomposed and can be parsed out. Okay, so if we want to, in principle, these could be grid computing problems. Okay, because you have again a built-in base of people that is really enthusiastic about birds. It's kind of like the astronomy folks. Is anyone an amateur astronomer? They're very enthusiastic, and yet It's sort of an amateur science that has a lot of robustness behind it, okay? There aren't many fields like that. The world is not dripping with amateur electrical engineers. Well, a little bit, okay, but not like it is over here, okay? So this is a decomposable problem, and it generates useful things for people, unlike SETI. SETI, all you get if you're helping these guys is that congratulations, you didn't find anything again this week, right? We have all kinds of things that we could potentially give to people by doing this, okay? And the radar, you know, it could be, this is how much data you process, this is how many birds or bats or insects your computer has identified, and so on and so forth. Acoustic, it could be a list of species detected, and so on and so forth. Now, a pragmatist might come back and say, well, you don't need to parallel. I mean, you don't need to grid this. This can be done on a Diehl system or something that's local and small. Yeah, sure, that might be right. But this social science aspect, citizen science aspect, is cool. And even though it may be optional, it might still be desirable to grid something like this, okay? And keep in mind, the motivation of these people is very competitive. This mindset would not surprise me at all coming from a bunch of birders, okay? I know it's legitimately weird. So, the last thing I'm going to talk about is thermal imaging. We're sampling heat, we're seeing heat, light, okay? Heat is light. A little bit of background. Why do we care about this? As we've already talked about, a lot of animals move around at night, so we can't see them with our eyes, right? Outside our senses. So that's one of the reasons why we use all these remote sensing techniques. Radar and thermal imaging, they see in the dark. Long distance movements, if things are far away, we, by our own senses, may not be able to detect signals, whereas radars and thermal cameras, good ones anyway, can. And it's a thermal camera, so we can also assess what's happened to the animals or what the conditions around the animals are. So there's an environmental context kinds of set of questions that's possible with thermal imaging. Now, specific applications, we can use these cameras to corroborate other methods, like weather radars, right? Okay, it's not an insect, it's a bird, that kind of thing. A lot of migratory biology, movement, physiology is possible. I get a little bit involved in the alternative energy aspect. People are concerned about the effects of wind energy and concentrated solar power on flying animals. And you've probably heard about this at some level. I don't know, people are aware of the issues associated with wind energy. We hear a lot about eagles around here. I am more involved in the bats issue. It turns out bats seem to, we had a paper out last year, it seems to suggest that bats like to hang out near wind turbines. Like they go toward them. Like they might a dead tree in an open landscape. It's like a reference place that draws them in. And so bats are suffering a lot of mortality at the hands of wind turbines for that reason. It seems to be behavioral. But to see what's going on, we use thermal imaging. Concentrated solar is a little weird. Has anyone ever heard of Ivanpah? Okay, a couple of you. This is one of Ivanpah's 3 solar concentrating towers. They're all in the same region of the Mojave Desert. When you look at it from the highway like this, it sort of looks like a pool of water. But what we're going to focus on here is the tower, and you can kind of see, we could have a little halo around that thing. It's a little better. Can you guys see that a little bit, sort of a halo here? So what's happening is all this light is being reflected and concentrated onto this region here. There's a boiler in here. Water boils, makes steam, turns a turbine, creates electricity, solar power, right? What happens, however, is that this region of airspace around these concentrating towers, it's not heated per se, but there's a high density of solar energy moving through that airspace, of course. It's like an inverted magnifying glass, right? Where does the bug not want to be? At the focus of the magnifying glass. Well, birds end up flying through these regions of airspace, and unfortunately, they end up getting literally fried as they fly through. And I tell you, you can hardly, if someone was to challenge you to come up with a more dramatic way to publicize a negative aspect of your alternative energy idea, I could hardly think of something more dramatic than this. This has generated a lot of emotional response. We were asked to go in there and study this. I'm not going to talk about those results today, but suffice to say that people are looking forward to our paper on this. I'm not looking forward to publishing it, frankly. This is one of the high-end scientific grade camera that we use for this stuff. This generates huge amounts of data, okay? Literally 2 gigabytes a minute, okay? And we'll look at some of the imagery here right now, assuming I can play this. Okay, so this is bird and insect migration in Alabama. We're pointing the camera straight up and things are flying through, okay? By and large, things that are moving fast are low and more likely to be birds, but some things are moving really slowly. I think most of the targets, there you can see a few here, are moving from the top down, which is to say they're moving south over the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, that's what they're doing. So this is just this little snip to give you a sense for what these things see. So that's it right there. Some insects, okay?
That's after they've been fried by the solar thing?
This is completely different. This is pre-frying, by the way. So, just for clarity, there's no Ivanpah yet in Alabama, so this is a little bit of migration that's seen by Alabama. This camera can detect birds 2.5 kilometers straight up. That's how sensitive it is, okay? By their heat signatures, by the heat that they're radiating. Okay. So the upshot here is that we can use the camera to gather all kinds of data. We can get direction, obviously temperature of the individual, background temperature, abundance, behavioral responses, even wing beating in certain circumstances. And we can even, perhaps in certain circumstances, infer altitude. These are the things that we're interested in doing. And it's not just with this camera. All thermal cameras and near-infrared cameras have these kinds of challenges. I've done a little bit of programming on this. This is the current environment. Not that matters a whole lot. And the things that I am working to overcome, a lot of filtering. Don't worry about what that means. Atmospheric irregularities, anthropogenic structure. After that, there would be a target direction detection and tracking algorithm to be applied. And I think what's important in this project is that speed of the algorithm, I don't care so much. In any of these, I'm not so hung up on how fast it is. Accuracy is far more important than speed in everything that we've talked about today. Because with certain exceptions, most of this is not real-time or near real-time, which is to say not time critical. Okay. Here's one image. This is just a picture. And I could even turn out the lights here. Sorry. Oh. And you can readily see, that's a bird. I have no idea what some of these other things are, but there are actually, I think, 8 targets in this one snapshot. Okay. Those are they. So they can be very faint. So that even the eye, if you were to look through this stuff, would have trouble picking out. I can barely see it. I can see it here. I can see it from here, that there's a target there. But you would have to stand up next to the board with me and look to see it yourself. So it would even be difficult for a human to do a good job at something like this. I see you yawning, so I probably shouldn't have turned out the light. So what we've done so far, as I've told you, this is what you see when you look at the camera. And by the way, it's 720 by 1280. Every pixel is a measure of temperature. Okay, every pixel, and I think it's 12-bit. So it's deep. All right. And what you're seeing here is some atmospheric irregularities. That's the background, the purple in there. There are thermal irregularities in the atmosphere that the camera's capturing. We have some targets, biological things. We have what's called a non-uniformity correction, leaving artifacts in the data. And we want to try to get rid of these things so they don't get inadvertently tracked. I've done this using what I call median smoothing, but that's what this is the result of, and I've layered a few. This is actually the central image of this, and so this is the same data, smoothing the background. That seems to work. It's not real fast, and then I'm trying to do some tracking, which it's just bad. Okay, so this is when you have targets moving around in this frame, you want to be able to track them so that you can get speed, direction, that kind of information. Okay, and so I've just plotted a few of them out here, but Like for example, this one changes its sign, which means that it got classified as something new when it shouldn't. So it doesn't work yet. Okay. These are the problems that I'm trying to solve with this. I want to give you one more example, just to give you a flavor for how challenging the problem can be. This is another sample of biological stuff flying around the atmosphere. In this case, it's mostly insects. Now, can you imagine writing an algorithm that can handle that? Someone tell me they can imagine writing an algorithm that can handle that. We see stuff like this. Not often. It's usually the other thing, okay? And this is sort of a swarming situation going on. But nonetheless, this gives you a flavor for how challenging the tracking problem is associated with this, okay? I'm going to leave you with that. These are some of the collaborators that I associate with some of the things I've talked about with you today. If any of this interests you, by all means, feel free. We can chat about it. I'm working with John on the radar stuff. But nonetheless, then this is just a tiny, tiny sample of the way that ecologists are using remote sensing and need access to scientific computing to solve some of their, what ultimately become noise-related data problems. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. I think we have time for one, maybe two questions.
Richard.
Yes.
For the near infrared, that data is only pulling that data during the day, right?
No, 24 hours, anytime.
24 hours?
Yeah, it's actually not in near infrared, it's infrared. Technically it's mid-infrared. So, but you would be right, near infrared, you actually need to illuminate with near infrared.
All right, I
Yep.
thought you said near infrared.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah. Anything else? Nothing? Seriously. Thank you, yes.
Why birds?
Why not? Next. Okay, that's a good question. You mean for me?
Yes.
That's, wow, it's been a long time since I've been asked that. When I was 9, I started bird watching, okay? And when I was 19, or 18, I started programming. And then those two sort of came together. I was never really a birder in the crazy sense. No offense to anybody who might be enthusiast. I was never a bird enthusiast, but always interested. And then the computing came late, and I put those two things together.
From how careful you are with that, it seems to be cool that dark alleys or something.
Yeah, dark alleys. Any other questions? Nothing. One more question.
Make something up.
So the implication by this is that you have no interest. Thank you. Yeah.
So it's still a little mind-boggling to me that so there's so much information about the biology in the radar detectors, and you said they're starting to change. Is that because the meteorologists are, in addition to taking this, or are they working more collaboratively with?
That's a good question. This is just starting to happen. We've identified a few radar meteorologists that have seen the light, if I may, and are starting to work collaboratively with us to do radar biology, if you will. Okay, and that's really important to have their buy-in, because those are the guys, men and women, who have access to the resources that we need to do this work better. They're at the University of Oklahoma. They work for the National Severe Storms Lab, okay, and other entities that have access to gear and have the ability to implement algorithms in their data processing pipelines. If we wanted to do something biological as opposed to meteorological, we would need to know these people. So it's not just the interest from them, but the access that they provide that helps as well.
And this is actually a two-part question. I noticed in the maps also there seemed to be a lot more information, or at least it'd be more dense towards the south than up, say, by us. Is that because of the density of the radar where they're located? Or?
No, it's actually where more of the biology happens. It's a biologically real result. Most migration, this is songbird migration. There are maybe 450 songbirds that migrate, across the continent. 400 species, not individuals. And most songbird migration is in the eastern and central United States. It does happen here, and then the western coast gets a lot as well. But we're kind of in a little bit of a, not a void, but a low density area. So that, what you saw there was more biologically real, and not an artifact of the distribution of radars.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay, you're very welcome. Thank you.